The day they dragged Mae Sutton's name through the dirt in open court, she was wearing her dead mother's dress. It was the nicest thing she owned. Pale blue cotton, mended twice at the collar, pressed flat with an iron she'd heated over a fire she could barely afford to keep lit. She'd worn it because she thought looking respectable might matter. She thought wrong. Judge Harlan Voss sat at the bench, like a man who had never once in his life been told no. He had the kind of face that came from decades of people agreeing with him, soft around the jaw, certain in the eyes. He looked at Mae the way a man looks at a fence post he's decided to pull up. Not with anger, with convenience. "Miss Sutton," he said, and the way he said it made her name sound like a problem. "Do you understand the nature of this proceeding?" She understood it fine. She understood that her father, Thomas Sutton, had died 11 months ago, with a deed to 400 acres of grazing land outside Cutter's Creek, Texas, and that 3 weeks after they put him in the ground, a tax lien had appeared in the county record that nobody had ever told him about. She understood that the lien had been filed in 1881, 4 years before her father ever bought the land, which should have made it impossible, legally speaking. She understood that she had pointed this out to 2 different lawyers in town, and that both of them had taken a sudden interest in not returning her visits. She also understood that Judge Voss owned the bank that held the note on nearly every piece of property within 30 miles of that courthouse. "I understand it," Mae said. He gave her a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Then you'll understand that the county has no choice but to proceed with the sale. Unless you can produce payment in full by Friday." $340. She had 11. She stood up straight anyway. Her mother had taught her that you stand straight even when your knees are going, especially then. "I'd like to request a continuance," she said, "to examine the original filing." Voss made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. From the gallery came a murmur, and Mae didn't have to turn around to know who was back there. Everett Crane. He ran the land office and sat on Voss's Sunday school committee and had been making quiet offers on her father's property for the better part of 2 years. He'd offered Thomas Sutton 6 cents on the dollar last spring, and her father had told him what he could do with that offer, and they had not spoken since. Now Thomas Sutton was dead, and Mae was standing in a courthouse in her mother's mended dress, asking for time she suspected no one intended to give her. "Request denied," Voss said. "Friday, Miss Sutton. Good day." She walked out of that courthouse into the flat white heat of a Texas afternoon and didn't let herself cry until she reached the corner of Birch Street, where there was a gap between the dry goods store and the saddler's that nobody could see into from the road. She stood in that gap and pressed her back against the saddler's wall and let herself shake for about 2 minutes. Then she stopped. Shaking didn't change anything. It never had. The man who changed everything was leaning against the livery fence when she walked back toward the edge of town, and he wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there with his hat tilted against the sun and his arms crossed, watching the courthouse steps the way you watch something you don't entirely trust. His name was Rourke Delamy. She would find that out later. At the time, he was just a stranger with trail dust on his coat and a look on his face like he'd seen something that disagreed with him. He nodded when she passed. She didn't stop, but he called after her. "You the Sutton girl?" She turned around slowly. "I'm Mae Sutton, yes, thought so." He straightened up from the fence. He was taller than she'd expected. "Your father sold a horse to my uncle back in '79. Chestnut mare with a white left sock. He said Tom Sutton was the most honest man he'd ever bought a horse from." Mae looked at him for a moment. "Your uncle was right. I know it." He pulled his hat brim down a half-inch. "I was in the back of that courtroom just now. I came to town for other reasons, but—" He stopped, seemed to consider his next words with more care than most men bothered to. "I used to work county records, before I came out west. Back in Virginia. That's a long way from here, it is." He met her eyes. "Long enough that I don't owe anybody in Cutter's Creek anything. Which means I can tell you that what that judge did in there today isn't legal. That filing date is wrong by 4 years. I could see it from where I was sitting." Mae felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. She'd gotten past the easy kind of hope sometime around the second lawyer's visit. Something more careful than hope. Something that kept its coat on. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked almost uncomfortable about it. "Because somebody ought to." His name was Rourke Delamy, and he had come to Cutter's Creek because his younger sister Bet lived there with her husband, and his brother-in-law had written him a worried letter about a land dispute of his own. He was 34 years old. He had worked in the Virginia County Clerk's office for 6 years before the death of his father had sent him west. He was not a lawyer. He was not wealthy. He owned a horse, a rifle, a decent saddle, and apparently a thorough understanding of property record law that he had never expected to use in Texas. He explained all of this to Mae over coffee at the counter of Alma's restaurant, where the waitress kept refilling their cups without being asked and pretending she wasn't listening. "The thing is," Rourke said, wrapping both hands around his mug, "a backdated lien doesn't just appear. Somebody put it there. Which means there's a record of who filed it and when, and if that record doesn't match the date on the document itself, you've got proof of fraud. And where would that record be? County Land Office." Mae thought about Everett Crane and his convenient offers. "The County Land Office is run by Everett Crane." Rourke nodded slowly. "I noticed his name on the filing. He's been trying to buy my father's land for 2 years. I noticed that too." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, 2 boys ran past the window chasing a dog, and for a second the afternoon looked completely ordinary, just dust and sun, the sound of a dog barking. Then it settled back into what it was. "I can't get into that office," Mae said. "He knows who I am. He doesn't know who I am," Rourke said. She told him no twice. The first time, she meant it. The second time, she was already thinking about what she would need him to look for. What she knew about the land office. It opened at 8 and closed at 5. Everett Crane took his dinner at the hotel across the street every day at noon, which took him about 45 minutes because he liked to linger over his coffee the way men do when other people are paying for it. The deputy clerk was a young man named Willis, who had the unfortunate habit of stepping out back to smoke at regular intervals throughout the afternoon. What she knew about the law, because her father had been a meticulous man who distrusted most institutions and kept copies of everything, was that the original deed to the Sutton property had been filed in 1885, and any lien predating that filing had no legal standing against the current owner. She had her father's copy of the deed. What she needed was proof that the lien had been created after the fact. What she needed was the actual entry ledger, not a copy, the original. Rourke went into the land office on a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, presenting himself as a potential buyer looking to research available properties. Willis was helpful and thoroughly uninterested. He pointed Rourke toward the general index and left him to it when the urge for a cigarette struck at 2:15. Rourke had 12 minutes. He found the original entry ledger for 1881. He found the page where the Sutton lien should have appeared. He found instead a page where the ink on one entry was a distinctly different shade from every other entry around it, slightly bluer, slightly thinner, and where the handwriting, while clearly attempting to match the surrounding entries, curved differently on the letters O and R and T than every other O and R and T on that page. He didn't take the ledger. He couldn't take the ledger. What he took was a piece of paper on which he wrote down, in precise detail, exactly what he had observed. The page number, the entry number, the ink variation, the letterform differences, the entries immediately before and after, with their dates, their filing parties, their witnesses. He was back at the general index when Willis returned from his cigarette. Mae read his notes 3 times at her kitchen table that night with a lamp burning low. She had her father's deed. She had Rourke's observations. What she did not have was a lawyer willing to bring either of those things into a courtroom, or a judge who wasn't the same man who had already ruled against her. "There has to be a circuit judge," she said. Rourke was leaning against the wall near the door in a way that suggested he was ready to leave if she wanted him to. He'd been careful about that. Careful not to make himself at home in her space without being asked, which she noticed. "There is. Judge Atticus Brierly, out of Millhaven. He comes through the district twice a year. When? 6 weeks. I have until Friday." They looked at each other. "Then you need to file for an emergency appeal," Rourke said, "on grounds of fraudulent documentation. I told you. Nobody in this county will. Not in this county." He reached into his coat and pulled out a letter, folded and slightly worn at the crease. "My sister's husband has been fighting a different property dispute. He hired a lawyer out of San Antonio, man named Edwin Foss. He's been up here twice already. He doesn't like Voss." Mae took the letter. "Read it." Edwin Foss had written it, and it was direct and specific, and made clear that he had, in the past year, identified 3 other fraudulent liens in Cutters Creek County records, all involving properties adjacent to land currently owned or acquired by Everett Crane. 3 other families. He's been doing this to other people, Mae said. It wasn't a question. At least 3 that Foss knows about. Rourke's voice was level, possibly more. She put the letter down on the table. She pressed her palm flat against it. She thought about her father, who had paid fair price for that land and worked it for 20 years, and died believing it would be there when he was gone. "What does Foss need from me?" she said. Edwin Foss arrived on Tuesday morning, 2 days before the county's Friday deadline, in a suit that had seen better days, and with a leather satchel so full of papers it didn't close properly. He was a small man, compact and quick, with the kind of eyes that moved across a room the way they might move across a document, cataloging, sorting, noting. He shook Mae's hand like he meant it. "I've been waiting for someone to bring me the Sutton property," he said, sitting down at her table and opening that overstuffed satchel. "Crane has been working this county for 4 years. Voss covers for him, but they've gotten sloppy. The lien that got your father's property is the sloppiest one I've seen. Can you stop the sale? I can file an emergency injunction in federal court by tomorrow morning." He pulled out a document and slid it across the table. "But I need your signature, and I need you to be prepared for the fact that Voss is going to be very unhappy about this. I expect he will be." Foss looked at her with something like appreciation. "Most people, when I tell them the judge is going to be unhappy, get nervous." "I've been nervous," Mae said. "I'm past it," she signed. What happened next did not happen cleanly or quickly, because nothing real ever does. Voss issued an order attempting to block the federal filing. Edwin Foss informed him, in a letter that was reportedly read aloud at the county commissioners' meeting, and that people in Cutters Creek were still quoting 6 months later, that a county judge had no jurisdiction to block a federal filing, and that attempting to do so might be construed as obstruction, which was a word that tended to interest federal authorities considerably. Everett Crane closed the land office on Wednesday and did not reopen it. The sheriff, a man named Aldous Greer, who had apparently been waiting for someone to give him permission, rode out to Crane's property on Thursday morning with a federal marshal and 2 deputies, and Crane was not there. His horse was gone. His office safe was open and empty. He was found 4 days later in a boarding house in Laredo, which turned out to be relevant to 3 other counties who also had questions for him. The hearing before Judge Atticus Brierly took place on a Monday 6 weeks later, in the county courthouse that had last seen Mae in her mother's mended dress. She wore a different dress this time. Not because she thought it would change anything, she was past that, but because her neighbor Alma, who owned the restaurant, had pressed it on her the night before, and told her she deserved to walk in looking like herself, not like someone who'd been beaten down. Alma had opinions about that sort of thing, and she wasn't wrong. Brierly was nothing like Voss. He was a compact man in his 60s with a white mustache and the manner of someone who had presided over enough nonsense in his life to have 0 patience remaining for it. He read the evidence with his glasses low on his nose and made small sounds that were impossible to interpret. Foss presented the original ledger, subpoenaed from the county records, which turned out to still exist despite what had apparently been Crane's hasty effort to clean things up. He presented the ink analysis from a document examiner he'd brought from San Antonio. He presented affidavits from 3 other families who had been subjected to the same scheme. And Mae stood up and presented her father's deed, the original, in Thomas Sutton's careful handwriting, purchased fair and legal in 1885, and she said quietly and clearly that her father had spent 20 years building something honest on that land, and that whatever had been done to his name and his record in this county was not a matter of paperwork. It was a matter of who he was and what he had earned. The courtroom was very quiet when she sat down. Brierly took 20 minutes. Then he came back and ruled that the lien was fraudulent, that the sale was null, that the Sutton property remained in Mae's name, and that the matter of Judge Voss's involvement in the scheme was being referred to the State Judicial Review Board for investigation. Voss was removed from the bench 14 weeks later. The town did not transform overnight. Towns don't. But things shifted in the way that things shift when a weight has been lifted from somewhere people didn't realize they'd been carrying. Like a collective exhale. 2 other families filed successful challenges to Crane's fraudulent liens within the month. A third followed after. Property that had been quietly absorbed into Crane's holdings over 4 years began returning to the people it had been taken from through proceedings that Edwin Foss handled with the focused satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to do this particular work. Mae stayed. She had thought, in the worst weeks of it, that even if she won, she might not be able to stay, that the county would always feel like the place that had tried to take everything. But it didn't feel like that anymore. It felt like the place where Alma had pressed her dress and said she deserved to walk in looking like herself. It felt like the place where the farmer who owned the property east of her father's land had shown up one morning with 2 of his sons to help her fix the fence line that had been let go while the dispute dragged on. It felt like the place where the young woman who worked at the dry goods counter had quietly told her that her own family had lost 20 acres 5 years ago, and she'd never known there was anything to be done. And thank you, Mae, because now maybe there was. Rourke Delamy stayed longer than he'd intended. He told himself, and then told Mae, and then stopped telling either of them anything, and just helped fix the fence. He knew more about fence repair than she'd expected, which turned out to be true of several things. She asked him once, in the early evening of a day they'd spent clearing the east field, why he'd said something to her outside that livery. He could have walked past. Most people had. He thought about it with the same care he seemed to give everything. My uncle told me once that Tom Sutton was the most honest man he'd ever bought a horse from, he said finally. A man like that deserved somebody saying something. Mae looked out at the field, her father's field, her field, 400 acres of Texas earth that was nobody's to take. He would have liked you, she said. Rourke pulled a fence post another inch into the ground. I hope so. The sun went down over Cutter's Creek the way it always had, wide and red and indifferent to the affairs of judges and land schemers, throwing long shadows across the property that had been fought for and held and now at last was simply home. Mae Sutton stood in the middle of it and let herself feel, for the first time in almost a year, that her feet were on solid ground.